Thank you, Igor, for that introduction, and Carol and the rest of the Exopolitics Czech team for inviting me here. And I'm looking forward to talking about what I've learned about extraterrestrial life and US policy, because I know people in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and Eastern Europe are interested. They want to know, what has the US been doing? And I want to tell you what I've learned from my research over the last 11 years, since I have been actively studying this as my main field of research. And my background is as a political scientist, and so much of what I'm going to present to you reflects that in the way I order the study, the presentation. So I hope you enjoy it. So first I'm going to look at an exopolitics definition, just so that we are familiar with what this term means. The way I define it and understand it is that it's the study of the political actors, institutions, and processes associated with extraterrestrial life. That this means we just look at the evidence. What is the evidence concerning extraterrestrial life? Forgetting the question of, is it real? Is it made up? What's conclusive, and so forth. We just look at the evidence. What is the evidence of this phenomenon? Because there's a lot of evidence that points to extraterrestrial life really visiting our world for a long time. But I want to also mention that it doesn't require, the field of exopolitics doesn't require that one accepts the evidence of extraterrestrial life as conclusive. Only the possibility is required for exopolitics to exist as a formal field of study. In the field of political science, especially in national security studies, one does not have to conclusively prove, for example, that another nation is going to invade your nation so that you can buy your military weapons and you can change your national security. Only you have to show that there is a possibility that this might happen for you to invest resources and money for a military and to buy weaponry and advanced technology and so forth. So all we need to show is that there is a possibility of extraterrestrial life existing for it to have very powerful national security implications. So I want to begin this presentation by looking at what are the official public policy documents that exist in the United States that reflect this issue of extraterrestrial life being something that has genuine national security concerns. Has the US government and major institutions dealt with this? And I want to say that yes, there has been some interest in this through some very official US public policy documents and agencies. Two reports in particular that I will mention. One is from 1953 that was sponsored by the CIA, even though it was not acknowledged at the time, and that was the Robinson Panel, which issued a report in January of 1953 called the Durant Report, which set out official US policy on the issue of flying saucers. They didn't use UFO at that time, they talked about flying saucers. And in 1960, the Brookings Institute released a report that was that was commissioned by NASA and was submitted to the US Congress as official policy, so that the Congress would be guided in how they dealt with this issue of extraterrestrial life. So what did the Robinson Panel recommend? It concluded that the UFOs were not a national security threat. The threat, according to the Robinson Panel, was hysterical public reaction, and it recommended a debunking policy. So the debunking would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers. That was the term that was used in the report, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media, such as a program should tend to reduce the current gullibility of the public and consequently their susceptibility to clever, hostile propaganda. That was 1953. So you have to imagine the situation. Washington, D.C. and many parts of the United States at the time were having thousands of UFO or flying saucer reports in the skies. People were seeing flying saucers. People were writing about the reports. Books were being written. Magazines were writing stories. And the US government, the official position was that these flying saucers are not real, but because people were getting upset about what they were seeing, this was a national security threat. So the national security threat was not what people were seeing, but what people believed they were seeing. So this is kind of doublespeak. So what the Robinson panel did was it set up, it was part of an effort by the CIA in creating this psychological strategy board that was responsible for Cold War psychological warfare. So the debunking and mass education to reduce belief in UFOs and flying saucers was a part of a psychological warfare strategy adopted as official US policy on UFOs and possible extraterrestrial life. So the position taken by this report and the CIA, that was the sponsor of the Robinson panel and the report at issue, was that psychological warfare had to be conducted against the American people to reduce belief in flying saucers and UFOs and, of course, extraterrestrial life. That this became official policy. The second report, the official report, was the Brookings Institute report, and that was released in December 14, 1960, with one section titled Implications of a Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life. So this was an official report submitted to the US Congress by NASA. So this is what the report says. Evidences of its extraterrestrial existence might also be found in artifacts left on the moon or other planets. This was logical because NASA was sending rockets to outer space and into the planet, other planets, the moon and Mars, Venus. And so the Brookings report was going to advise Congress on what would be the implications of NASA exploration finding evidence of extraterrestrial life. So the report continued, the consequences for attitudes and values are unpredictable, but would vary profoundly in different cultures and between groups within complex societies. A crucial factor would be the nature of the communication between us and the other beings. Societies sure of their own place in the universe have disintegrated when confronted by a superior society, and others have survived even though changed. So NASA is advising the US Congress that the announcement of the discovery of extraterrestrial life could be extremely disturbing, so much so that society could disintegrate. So this has obviously very extreme national security implications. The report justified policy-making responsibility on extraterrestrial life by the national security system. So the Pentagon was officially sanctioned here as having responsibility, because if society could disintegrate, not just in the United States but worldwide, this had to be something that the Pentagon and the national security system would have responsibility. The discovery or disclosure of extraterrestrial life would not be part of the normal political process, for example, Congress. So this would not be something that Congress would debate, such as they debate healthcare, taxation. This would be something that would be dealt with secretly. So this is what the Brookings Institute basically justified, so that Congress would know, that elected officials in Congress would know why this is not an issue that they have any power over, because it is something that has national security implications, where there is security clearances involved, and it is outside of the normal political process. And so Congress basically is not made aware of this issue. So Brookings Institute cites non-disclosure as a valid process. The Brookings report raised a possible public policy response of suppressing discovery of extraterrestrial life or artifacts for national security reasons. Quote, how might such information under what circumstances be presented or withheld from the public? So the Brookings Institute is saying here, on behalf of NASA to the Congress, that it may be very valid to withhold this information from the public. So that was delivered in 1961, and the report justified why Congress should not get involved in the UFO issue. So that's the official position on UFOs, flying saucers, and extraterrestrial life. What I want to do now is spend the rest of my presentation talking about documents, whistleblowers, that really outline the covert or the unofficial policy of the United States, because now we know from what the Durant report, the Robinson panel, and the Brookings report have told us that the American public are not going to be told the truth. So what is the truth? How do we find out the truth? We find out the truth by a number of documents that have been released, a number of unofficial leaked documents. These are documents that are not acknowledged to be valid documents by the US policymakers or by various US institutions, but nevertheless they have been leaked, and these documents have been studied by various UFO researchers and have been shown to be not really have any sign of fraud. In other words, they appear to be valid public policy documents, even though they are not acknowledged by the FBI, CIA, and the national security system. So as a political scientist, these documents, and of course the whistleblower testimonies, are very, very interesting. So what I've done is I've categorized or classified all of this information in 10 categories. And so my presentation, I'm going to spend basically looking through these categories, each one systematically. So there are the 10 categories, beginning 1 to 5, beginning in 1939, 1942, 47, and then I move on to 1952, 54, 61, 93, and 2009. And I'll look at all of these in depth, giving you an idea of how public policy on extraterrestrial life has evolved, that is, unofficially, in the United States. So I'm going to begin in 1939 with President Roosevelt, where he learns of extraterrestrial life and technology. This comes from witnesses who revealed that the Secretary of State under President Roosevelt, his name was Cordell Hull, he showed wreckage of UFOs and 4 alien bodies that was stored in the US Capitol building to a cousin. This was one of his cousins, the Reverend Turner Hamilton, and the daughters of this Reverend Hamilton described what happened. One day when my father was in DC, Cordell swore him to secrecy and took him to a sub-basement in the US Capitol building and showed him an amazing sight. 4 large glass jars holding 4 creatures unknown to my father or Cordell, a wrecked round craft of some kind nearby. My father wanted my sister and I to make this information known long after he and Cordell were dead, because he felt it was a very important bit of information. So this is a very interesting anecdote. It's certainly not proof. It doesn't rise to the level of proof by any means, because it's second-hand witness testimony of what someone else said that they saw in the US Congress. But still, I thought it was interesting to show you that there is evidence of this knowledge of extraterrestrials going back into the Roosevelt administration in 1939, before the United States got into war and before the Second World War began. But it's really 1942 that we can say pretty conclusively that the US began a policy concerning extraterrestrial life and the flying saucer phenomenon as it was then known. It began in 1942 with what was called the Los Angeles air raid. In December of 1941, the United States entered the Second World War, declaring war on Japan and then Germany. And so in January of 1942, there was an air raid alert over Los Angeles, and there was bombing.
The news of the world, Wednesday, February 25th. Once again, Columbia's correspondents in world capitals and the fighting zones in the Western Pacific are ready to give you the latest news direct by shortwave radio.
And now for news of our own West Coast, we take you to Los Angeles and the report of Byron Palmer.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane. Watchers on the rooftop of the Columbia Broadcasting Building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a wide arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights. The object moved southward, presumably over Huntington Park at the western edge of Los Angeles, and on southward to about Long Beach on the coast. By 3:30 a.m., observers said the object appeared to be over the south of Long Beach. Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their glare. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it. The shooting stopped about 3:30 a.m. The shooting brought warfare to the front door of this city of 1.25 million population for the first time since December 7th. Already it was alert to the presence off the Southern California coast of a Japanese submarine which had pumped 25 shells into an oil field north of Santa Barbara Monday evening. Because of the presence of the submarine, a 3-hour alert was ordered at dusk last night, and civilian authorities stood at their posts while the Army and Navy continued their search for the submersible. The evening alert ended at 10:23 p.m., but another was sounded at 2:22 a.m., and the blackout followed within 3 minutes. It covered Los Angeles County from Santa Monica to Pomona. At 2:27, all Southern California radio stations were ordered off the air except those in San Diego. Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. The guns went into action again, hurling round after round of shells at the object. The second barrage appeared to be closer to downtown Los Angeles, since watchers could hear the concussion of the guns more clearly, and the flash of bursting shells was brighter. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean. We return you now to CBS in New York.
So, and the important thing here is you can see one of the negatives. These were craft, some sort of craft that flew over Los Angeles in February of 1942, and you can see the beams, the search beams that were looking for bombers, and they were trying to find what were the aircraft, but they couldn't actually locate them. There was no bombing. The aircraft weren't bombing anything, but there was a lot of artillery from the U.S. military at the time shooting at these craft. So there's a report here which maybe will explain it a little better. So basically what happened was that on February 25th, air raid sirens were activated by the military in Los Angeles, and it was blacked out. Basically everything went dark. People scrambled from their beds in panic. Thousands of air raid wardens went to their signposts. Something had been spotted in the air approaching the city, and the possibility of enemy attack was exceptionally real to a nation now at war. So the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade began firing their anti-aircraft guns at the target. Firing continued for an hour. And during this time, 3 people died. There were a number of injuries, and many houses were destroyed by the shells. So this was a very serious incident. But the things that they were firing at, the aircraft that they were firing at, never fired back. They were more or less stationary. And then there were reports about it in the papers, and then the incident was forgotten because now the country was at war. But what we have discovered from some of these leaked documents was, in fact, one of those craft over Los Angeles was in fact a UFO, and that it had been shot down. So here's a top secret memo from President Roosevelt to his Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, in February of 1942. So what he says in this memo is that they recovered an extraterrestrial vehicle from the Los Angeles incident. And so this is what he said in the memo. I have considered the disposition of the material in possession of the Army that may be of great significance toward the development of a super weapon of war. I disagree with the argument that such information should be shared with our ally, the Soviet Union. Consultation with Dr. Bush and other scientists. Dr. Vannevar Bush was the scientist in charge of all weapons development in the United States during the Second World War. Other scientists on the issue of finding practical uses for the atomic secrets learned from the study of celestial devices preclude any further discussion, and therefore authorised Dr. Bush to proceed with the project without further delay. So basically they wanted to learn whether the extraterrestrial craft that they had discovered could give them any information about developing atomic weapons. This information is vital to the nation's superiority and must remain within the confines of state records. Any further discussion on the matter will be restricted to General Donovan, Dr. Bush, the Secretary of War, and yourself. The challenge our nation faces is daunting and perilous in this undertaking. I have committed the resources of the government towards that end. You have my assurance that when circumstances are favourable and we are victorious, the Army will have the fruits of research in exploring further applications of this new wonder. You may speak to me about this if the above is not clear. So basically, what President Roosevelt was advising was that these weapons are so advanced that the study of them might diminish the war effort. So rather than share secrets with the Soviet Union and other countries, they would keep this information secret until the time when the United States would be able to devote itself to understanding this technology. What was created back then, directly resulting from the Los Angeles air raid and from the recovery of these extraterrestrial devices, was a unit, an Army counterintelligence unit called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. And so here's a top secret memo by General Marshall on March 5th, 1942, revealing that the US Navy recovered the extraterrestrial vehicle after the LA air raid, and that a top secret investigative unit was created within the Army called the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. So this is what is said in here. The memo itself is not very clear, but I thought I would show it so that way you could see that this is an actual document. As indicated in my February 26 memorandum to you regarding the air raid over Los Angeles, it has been learned by Army G2, that's Army counterintelligence, that Rear Admiral Andwer, head of Naval Intelligence, has informed the War Department of a naval recovery of unidentified plane off the coast of California, not having any conventional explanation. And it goes on to say that the Army Air Corps recovered also a similar vehicle in the San Bernardino Mountains east of Los Angeles, so possibly two craft had been shot down from the Los Angeles aircraft. This headquarters has come into consideration that the mystery airplanes, in fact, are not earthly, and according to secret intelligence sources, they are in all probability of interplanetary origin. So this is a 1942 document saying that these craft that were recovered are interplanetary, extraterrestrial in nature. As a consequence, I've issued orders to Army G2 that a special intelligence unit be created to further investigate the phenomenon and report any significant connection between recent facilities and those collected by the Director of the Office of Coordination. So that top secret unit that was created was the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Now, for many years, the US Army and the Air Force denied that there existed such a unit, that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was made up, that UFO researchers were making this up, that it wasn't real. But in fact, this was revealed, this was confirmed in a Freedom of Information Act request made by a number of authors, Timothy Good being one of them, that in fact that this interplanetary phenomenon unit did exist. And there you can see that was 1987, that this is confirmed, that this says that please excuse the delay in responding to your request. Please be advised that the aforementioned Army unit was disestablished during the late 1950s and never reactivated. So basically, it's confirming that the interplanetary phenomenon unit did exist, and that in the 1950s, this memo is saying that it was disestablished. It was probably reconstituted under another name, but nevertheless, this is an important official Freedom of Information Act document confirming that the interplanetary phenomenon unit did exist. General Douglas MacArthur actually was part of the interplanetary phenomenon unit's investigations. In a 1981 Freedom of Information Act release, an Army bureaucratic department, which is called the Defense Central Index of Investigations, generated a computer printout revealing that the Interplanetary Phenomena Unit was investigating UFO sightings during the Pacific War under the command of General MacArthur. So what did General MacArthur learn? If General MacArthur was in charge of this Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, what was it that he learned? So again, I have a video.
The nations of the world will have to unite, or the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of the earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets.
So there you see that General MacArthur, based on the information he learned, was convinced that Earth had to prepare for an invasion. That was, he as an army officer, that was what he thought was the inevitable consequence. So that's essentially what you just heard there. That was in 1955 at a university in New York. And he said pretty much the same thing a few years later at a West Point academy, talking about this. So General MacArthur, from what he had learned through the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, believed that our world was on the verge of an interplanetary war. So, what other information do we have about US policy on extraterrestrials? Well, we learn a lot from looking at how the Roswell UFO crash was handled. It was of course, you probably know the basics of this incident. In July 8, 1947, newspaper reports emerged that a flying saucer had crashed in Roswell, New Mexico, or near the town of Roswell, New Mexico. And this man, Lieutenant Walter Halt, he was the public information officer for the Army base at Roswell, New Mexico, and he was the one that was given the order to release this press release, because he was told by the major of Army intelligence that what was recovered was a flying saucer, that a flying saucer had crashed, and that the colonel in charge at Roswell Army Air Base said, yes, go ahead and issue that order. In 2007, an affidavit was posthumously released where Walter Halt stated that he was personally taken to one of the Roswell hangars where he saw wreckage of an extraterrestrial vehicle and the body of 2 extraterrestrial vehicles. So this is a depiction of the crash at Roswell. And here you have the Hangar 84 at the Roswell Army Air Force Base. So Walter Halt, the lieutenant, was taken to this hangar and he saw some of the wreckage from Roswell and he saw some alien bodies. Halt revealed that the conflicting press releases were authorized by General Roger Ramey and the Pentagon to lead the public away from main flying saucer wreckage. So basically what happened was that in the original press report that I showed you, Walter Halt announced that a flying saucer had been recovered near Roswell, New Mexico. In fact, and then shortly after that, General Roger Ramey, the man in charge of that area for the US Army, he basically said that there was no substance to this, that this was just a weather balloon. And so the Roswell flying saucer issue disappeared from the newspapers. But in fact, how it revealed that the conflicting reports were part of a public policy of deceiving the public about extraterrestrial life and technology. That the first press report was referring to a crash where there was only a small amount of wreckage that the military thought that they could contain. And that's what they wanted the public to think. They wanted the public to go there to look for whatever they could find, but most of it had been already removed. But that the main flying saucer site was something further away, and that they wanted the public to be deceived, that there was nothing at all in the story. So that's why they came up with two stories. One saying there was something at the wrong location, and the other story saying, well, there's nothing to this flying saucer crash. So now I move to President Truman and the Majestic 12 project, which is a big part of the cover-up in the United States. On September 24th, President Truman sent a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, authorizing a highly classified project to make policy on extraterrestrial life, which was called Operation Majestic 12. And that's the document, that's the document there that you can see, that this was a top secret, eyes only document that, again, is one of these documents that was released. And this is some of the people that were part of that original MJ-12, that study group. This is James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, and other military generals. So a FOIA request, that's FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act request. In the United States, many documents have been released through the Freedom of Information Act, starting in 1966 and 1974. And many of these documents help confirm some of the unofficial or the leaked documents that I've been referring to. So there was a release of a 1951 official memorandum by Wilbert Smith to the Canadian Control of Telecommunications concerning flying saucer technologies secretly studied in the US by a highly classified group by Vannevar Bush. So this is an official document released by the Freedom of Information Act confirming that, in fact, that the matter that is flying saucers, UFOs, is in the hands of the most highly classified, is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher than the H-bomb. So this is a Canadian bureaucrat with the Department of Transportation in Canada saying that the flying saucer issue is rated, classified more highly than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. The modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, the head of the President Truman's Science Advisory Team. And the entire matter is considered by the United States government to be of tremendous significance. In 1976, 3 top secret 1952 memos from the Joint Chiefs of Staff titled Joint Logistic Plan for Majestic were declassified and state, the following plans in support of Majestic are now under preparation: a psychological warfare plan, an unconventional warfare plan, cover, and deception plans, a civil affairs military plan, a command plan, logistic plan, and so forth. Basically what this is saying is that Majestic 12 was a vast undertaking, that this project designed to take control of UFOs, flying saucers, and the extraterrestrial issue had many projects associated with it, and these were all under the control of the Majestic 12 team and dealing with things such as psychological operations. And I mentioned earlier the Robinson panel that was sponsored by the CIA, that actually was part of this psychological warfare plan to convince the American public that there was nothing to this flying saucer phenomenon, even though people were seeing them in the skies, and they even flew over Washington, D.C. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now, which is probably one of the most famous incidents in the United States, and it was actually captured on film. But first some background to the Washington flyover. On November 1st of 1952, Ivy Mike was the first US test of a hydrogen bomb. It came 3 days before the election of President Eisenhower on November 4th. And you can see the destructive power of these tests. Ivy Mike was in 1952, that was the test that I just referred to. In 1954, that was the test of another hydrogen bomb. I'll talk about that later, the Bravo test. That was 15 megatons, this was 10 megatons. The Soviet Union later detonated a hydrogen bomb that was over 60 megatons. But here, down here is the tonnage of the tests in Hiroshima and Trinity. The Hiroshima test was 15 kilotons. So basically, the bomb that was dropped on, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima to end the Second World War was 1,000 times less in magnitude than the Bravo hydrogen bomb test in 1954. So you can see the magnitude of these tests. So these were very powerful weapons that were being developed, and it appeared extraterrestrials were very interested in that. There was much opposition. There were many scientists opposed to the development of hydrogen bombs in the United States. Some of them, such as Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, were involved in the creation of the atomic bomb that ended the Second World War. Others included Enrico Fermi, that were very critical of this. Extraterrestrials even appeared to be opposed to development of hydrogen bombs, and there is a very famous contactee by the name of George Van Tassel. On July 18, 1952, George Van Tassel sent a letter to the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base on behalf of extraterrestrials he claimed to be in contact with. The letter was received by the US Air Force on July 22nd, so this is official because Freedom of Information Act has confirmed this. The letter referred to the great danger of hydrogen bombs which could destroy the Earth. The letter also referred to the opposition of the atomic scientists to the hydrogen bomb. So this letter apparently that George Van Tassel said was communicated to him, that he said he was in telepathic communications and even physical contact with extraterrestrials, that they were opposed to hydrogen bombs. They wanted the US government and military not to develop these weapons. And what's very interesting is that the US UFO Washington flyover occurred from July 12 to 27 over 3 successive weekends during the presidential election campaign, and during this very time when Van Tassel was saying he was getting this communication from these extraterrestrials and writing to the US Air Force about this phenomenon. So again, I have a film here that I'm going to try to show. Let's see if this plays. Here we go. This is the footage of the Washington flyover, and you can see very clearly these are UFOs that were witnessed. They tracked on radar. US Air Force sent up jets to track these objects, and they couldn't do anything against them. And these were flying over the US Capitol, over the White House, over the Washington Mall. And we'll see that played again in a moment. So this was a very spectacular sighting over Washington, D.C., and people often ask, well, if UFOs are real, then why don't they come and land on the White House? Well, we have evidence. There they are, directly over the White House. And what did the American government do? I'll explain what they did in a moment. So, was the Washington flyover connected to Van Tassel's July 18 letter? I believe so. And this is what the United States decided to do. President Truman went onto public television to discuss the flying saucer sightings that were being seen all over the United States, that were even seen over Washington, D.C., over the White House and Congress. So what does President Truman say to the American public? So we have that recorded on film as well, so let me play that.
We discussed it at every conference that we had with the military. there's always things like that going on. Flying saucers, and we've had other things, if I'm not mistaken.
So as you can see, President Truman basically said that this was not an issue that he took seriously. So can you imagine the significance of this? You have flying saucers flying over Washington, D.C., over the White House, as you can see very clearly. It's depicted in footage, camera shots of thousands of witnesses. They have radar documenting that these objects were real, and President Truman comes on the air and says, well, this is just a lot of people seeing things and we don't know what they are, and that was that. So this is part of the official disinformation campaign. But so when people say, why don't flying saucers land on the White House or go to Washington, D.C., it's like, well, they have, and they've been ignored. So what did happen? So this is probably one of the most controversial issues about this whole phenomenon, and I understand if people are skeptical whether or not President Eisenhower did meet with extraterrestrials, but I just want to present to you the evidence, and the evidence is whistleblower testimony. These are people who have worked for the military or corporations who have seen documents or were physically present when President Eisenhower had what they believe were meetings with extraterrestrials. So I just want to present that data to you, and you can decide for yourself whether it's real or not. One of the witnesses, or one of the whistleblowers, was William Cooper. He served on the briefing team to a United States Admiral, Admiral Bernard Clary, commander of the Pacific Fleet. Cooper was on the intelligence briefing team from 1970 to 1973, and he saw documents. That was his job. His job was to basically be briefed on the intelligence matters that were part of these official documents, and some of them concerned extraterrestrials and UFOs, because this was a big issue for the United States Navy, because the Earth is 70% water. The United States Navy is, especially in the Pacific Fleet, I'm in Hawaii, we're in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is basically the biggest area on the planet where there is just no land, it's just ocean. And the United States Navy has responsibility for that whole area. And there are literally many, many thousands of UFO and underwater object sightings. So this is what William Cooper said he saw in official documents. A landing at Muroc, now Edwards Air Force Base, took place in 1954. The base was closed for 3 days and no one was allowed to enter or leave that time. And I can confirm, I've done research and confirmed through others that in fact the base at Edwards Air Force Base was closed for 3 days. No one knows why, for 3 days when President Eisenhower was in the area. On the appointed day, the president was spirited to the base. The excuse was given to the press that he was visiting a dentist. Witnesses to the event have stated that 3 UFOs flew over the base and then landed. President Eisenhower met with the aliens on February 20, 1954. A contractor by the name of Don Phillips, who also worked for the US Air Force, and he worked for Lockheed Martin as an engineer. He was one of the Disclosure Project press conference witnesses that Dr. Greer made known in 2001. And this is what Don Phillips had to say from the records he saw. He saw classified records. We have records from 1954 that there were meetings between our own leaders of this country and ETs here in California. And as I understand from the written documentation, we were asked if we would allow them to be here and do research. I have read that our reply was, well, how can we stop you? You are so advanced. And I will say by this camera and this sound that it was President Eisenhower that had this meeting, and it was on film, sort of like what we are doing now, because Phillips was being filmed. Here's another, this was an anonymous US Air Force colonel who gave testimony that appeared in 1982. And this was an Air Force who was a former pilot. He says, the pilot says he was one of 6 people at the meeting. 5 alien craft landed at the base, 2 were cigar-shaped and 3 were saucer-shaped. The aliens looked human-like, but not exactly. The aliens spoke English, supposedly informed the president that they wanted to start an educational program for the people of Earth. Here's another witness, Commander Charles Suggs. This was revealed by his son, Charles Suggs Jr. He was interviewed by Bill Hamilton, who was a fellow researcher that I know. And this is what he said that his father experienced back in 1954. Charlie's father, Navy Commander Charles Suggs, accompanied President Eisenhower, along with others on February 20. They met and spoke with two white-haired Nordics that had pale blue eyes and colourless lips. The spokesman stood a number of feet away from Ike and would not let him approach any closer. A second Nordic stood on the extended ramp of a biconvex saucer that stood on a tripod landing gear on the landing strip. According to Charlie, there were B-58 Hustlers on the field, even though the first one did not fly officially until 1956. The visitors said they came from another solar system. They posed detailed questions about our nuclear testing. So in 1954, February of 1954, President Eisenhower has a meeting with extraterrestrials in February of that year. And the important thing here is that this is 10 days before the United States was going to test its biggest ever hydrogen bomb. That was the Bravo test in March 1st of 1954. So the conclusion you could draw here is, well, if this meeting was true, if Eisenhower did meet with extraterrestrials, what were they discussing? Was it that the United States was about to detonate a hydrogen bomb in 10 days' time? And were the extraterrestrials making a plea to President Eisenhower for the last time not to go ahead with this program, that it was very damaging, not only for the Earth, but for the extraterrestrials? The most interesting testimony comes from Cristoforo Barbato, who met a Jesuit priest just outside the Vatican City. And this Jesuit priest said he was a member of the Servizio Informazioni del Vaticano. He told Barbato that on an occasion of the secret meeting at Muroc Air Force Base in 1954, military cameramen filmed the outstanding event with 3 movie cameras detached in different places, loaded with colour film and working by spring engines. Now you might think that's strange. Why would they film a meeting with President Eisenhower using spring engines, which were things that they used in the 1920s? In the 1950s, they had electronic cameras that could be used with power, AC, and so forth. So why would they use spring engines? Well, the answer is something that it might kind of awake a few people to some of these issues. That is that electromagnetic devices did not work around the extraterrestrials. That somehow their energy field and the energy field created around the flying saucers that they operated deactivated electronic devices. So things like cameras, film, photography equipment didn't work. Electronics didn't work. So they had to use a handspring to be able to film the craft using 1920s technology. So, did Eisenhower negotiate with extraterrestrials? Under the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, extraterrestrial technologies had been discovered, but they were not understood by scientists at the time. So, I referred a little earlier to the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit that was set up in 1942, that in 1942, President Roosevelt asked his science advisor, Vannevar Bush, to research these technologies, but Bush said that they were so advanced that they couldn't understand them. So it took them many years to understand these technologies, but even then they couldn't make the kind of progress they wanted. So it was only after 1954 when President Eisenhower reached agreements with extraterrestrials, or his administration reached agreements, that progress was made on reverse engineering some of these technologies. So in exchange for the assistance that President Eisenhower received, the extraterrestrial groups received certain privileges, such as being able to establish bases in the United States and access to Earth's natural resources. That is, being able to conduct biological experiments on Earth biological occupants. So what are some of the programs that were set up? The result of the secret meetings and agreements was extensive cooperation in developing advanced technologies was now possible. All extraterrestrial life and technology programs were highly classified, compartmentalized programs whose existence needed to be officially denied by those with need-to-know access. So in other words, if you were part of that privileged group who had need-to-know access. You had to be psychologically profiled to see whether you could keep the secret. If you could keep the secret, you had to have need-to-know access. You couldn't know everything. So, for example, if you had a need to know about extraterrestrial propulsion, that didn't mean that you had a need to know about extraterrestrial navigation systems. So everything was compartmentalized. Navigation, communications, propulsions, bioweapons, all of these things were compartmentalized. So people that were given need to know could only know a little part of that area that they were briefed to know. And if they were asked questions by members of the public, by members of the press, by Congress, they were instructed to deny. They had to say, no, 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 no such program exists. They couldn't say no comment. They had to say, such a program doesn't exist. This was their duty as being briefed into these documents. Now, one of the really important things about President Eisenhower was that I think he was very concerned over how this issue was being managed. He realized that there was a lot of power being given to this unelected committee called Majestic 12 to make decisions about the future not only of the United States but of planet Earth, and that they had access to the most advanced technologies and knowledge on the planet and the most disturbing secrets, and that this information was not being really handled well. President Eisenhower placed control over his governmental system into the hands of Nelson Rockefeller, who chaired the Advisory Committee on Government Organization and was also President Roosevelt's Special Assistant on Foreign Affairs. So that's, President Eisenhower's assistant. That's President Eisenhower. That's Nelson Rockefeller. This is the man that essentially represented the Rockefeller family, which is probably the most famous and powerful industrial family in the United States. And with his brother, he essentially got President Eisenhower to agree to many things that President Eisenhower eventually regretted greatly agreeing to. Rockefeller did two things that had a major impact on extraterrestrial affairs. One, he began the process of privatizing classified extraterrestrial technology by involving corporations as military contractors. And that's very important, so let me just explain this. Because basically, up until the Eisenhower administration, the Truman administration, the entities that were responsible for major industrial programs were entities that were under the control of, say, the major bureaucracies of the United States. Los Alamos National Laboratories, Sandia National Laboratories. These were huge laboratories that were under the control of the Truman administration, under the control of the President's office. They were parts of the US bureaucracy. And so all the vast science projects, such as the development of the atomic bomb, the development of the hydrogen bomb, were developed under these massive laboratories. What happened during the Eisenhower administration was that Rockefeller convinced President Eisenhower that in the future, big industrial projects had to be taken out of the hands of these big scientific laboratories that were under the control of the US bureaucracy and placed into the hands of the US corporations, major US corporations such as Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing and so forth, these major corporations. And he argued that this was important, a way of maintaining secrecy, so that in future, if the US needed any major industrial construction, such as developing major weapons systems, that these would be done by the corporations who would be awarded contracts by the US military. So this was different to the way it was done under Truman and Roosevelt before him. The second major development that Rockefeller did was that he removed direct presidential executive authority over classified extraterrestrial-related projects and placed them under the direct control of an appointed committee, Majestic 12. Majestic 12 was the committee created under President Truman to have oversight over all of the extraterrestrial projects. What Rockefeller did was he convinced Eisenhower that this committee had to be depoliticized. It had to be taken away from the hands of the political process, away from the hands of executive presidential authority, and basically have its own autonomous authority now, and would be responsible for extraterrestrial related programs, all programs. So Eisenhower agreed to that. And I think this is a big part of why Eisenhower came out with his military-industrial complex speech. So I want to play that for you so that you can hear Eisenhower's own words as to what he felt betrayed over.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. First, I should like to express my gratitude to the radio and television networks for the opportunities they have given me over the years to bring reports and messages to our nation. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
So as you can see, President Eisenhower was giving a warning, a very important warning about the military-industrial complex. And what he was really saying was that this was something that the future president had to guard against. That is President Kennedy, who was the incoming president at the time. So President Eisenhower warned Kennedy about the dangers posed by the military-industrial complex, but what he was really saying was that he was most concerned about the control over extraterrestrial issues, the UFO, the flying saucer issue, that he was concerned that the power had been taken away from the president and was now in the control of this unelected committee, Majestic 12, and that he felt that they had betrayed him, that they had basically put their own interests above the interests of the United States and were now operating essentially as a rogue entity, that is an entity out of the control of the United States presidential authority. So what did President Eisenhower do? Sorry, what did President Kennedy do? Well, on June 28, 1961, President Kennedy requested the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, for a review of MJ-12 intelligence operations as they relate to Cold War psychological operations, psychological warfare plans. So this is the document. This is one of the leaked documents that was released showing President Kennedy sending this memo to his national security apparatus in the United States, was telling the United States public that there's no reality to this extraterrestrial phenomenon, but in fact there was. It was real. So Kennedy began a UFO initiative. He wanted to know what was really happening. He wrote to Dulles, CIA director, and then Dulles replied back. And this is another leaked document from Dulles, basically referring to MJ-12, and he acknowledges that the UFO cases are of non-terrestrial origin. These do not constitute a physical threat to national defense. So what he's really telling Kennedy, Dulles in this document is telling Kennedy that, oh, don't be concerned about UFOs and flying saucers. They're not a national security threat. You know, you're president, you worry about housing and taxation, financing, and those sorts of things. But these UFO issues are nothing for you to worry about. There's nothing real to them. Dulles' letter goes on to say, for reasons of security, I cannot divulge pertinent data on some of the more sensitive aspects of MJ-12 activities. So here's the CIA director telling President Kennedy that he cannot tell the president what is happening with MJ-12, that it's too sensitive for the president. Imagine that. But that's what Dulles was telling him. And finally, Dulles' letter tells President Kennedy that he did not have need-to-know access when it came to sensitive aspects of MJ-12, that this committee, MJ-12, was doing things that were areas that President Kennedy need not bother with. He didn't have a need to know. Of course, Kennedy would have been angry. I think anyone would have been. But it took Kennedy a long time, and I actually have done a 1 hour presentation on Kennedy's response to his initiative to try and get the UFO issue declassified. I can only mention it here briefly in this presentation, but I did bring about 20 DVDs here, and they are there of my earlier presentation. They're over there by the desk where my book is being sold. So they are 20 DVDs, in English of course, of my President Kennedy UFO initiative. But let me just say that the way Kennedy tried to go around the opposition by the CIA to him getting access to UFO documents was that he came up with this idea that the way he could get access to the documents, because he was being denied, his administration was being denied access to information on extraterrestrial life. The way he could get access was to come up with a plan for the Soviet Union and the United States to jointly cooperate in outer space, and that they would launch joint missions to the moon. And that in doing so, they would share information amongst each other. And this, Kennedy believed, would be the way that he could force the CIA to release these documents to the State Department, to the Department of Defense, to NASA, and of course to the President's office. So on 20th of September 1963, President Kennedy made a proposal for joint USSR space and lunar missions. So I'm going to play you a video of this speech. But first I want to know, just by raise of hands, how many people know that President Kennedy in September of 1963 made a speech calling for the Soviet Union and the United States to cooperate and to go to space and to go to the moon together? How many people knew about this? Raise your hands. Okay, look at that. Only about half a dozen or so. That shows you why is it that this information is not widely known. So I'll play the speech so you can hear for yourself what President Kennedy had to say on this issue. Again, I have to go outside of my program.
Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure?
So there you hear President Kennedy being very serious in this initiative to have the United States cooperate with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar missions. Why did Kennedy do this? NASA was opposed. The US Congress was opposed. Many of his leading advisors were opposed. Many people didn't understand why Kennedy wanted to cooperate with the Soviet Union in going to the space. It was because Kennedy had another agenda. He wanted to use this joint cooperation with the Soviet Union in space missions as a means of getting control or access to these files that I've been talking about. And so in September 1963, President Kennedy initiated that proposal. Soviet Premier Khrushchev didn't respond immediately. He had to think about it. He had to think about whether or not the Soviet Union would be involved in this. On November 11, one of the Soviet missions, I believe it was the Venera spacecraft, failed. The Soviet space missions were not going to be easy, and Premier Khrushchev decided that he would accept Kennedy's offer, that he would cooperate with President Kennedy and bring about unprecedented coordination and cooperation between the United States and the USSR in joint space and lunar exploration. So he accepted on November 11. On November 12, 1963, Kennedy issued National Security Memorandum 271. So this is an official document. This is actually exists. You can find it on the government, the Library of Congress database. And this was a memorandum to NASA to share space information with the Soviet Union. The subject header was cooperation with the USSR on outer space matters. So this was a low security memo. As you can see here, confidential is blanked out. This was a confidential document that was then declassified and released under Freedom of Information Act, substantiating that indeed Kennedy asked NASA to cooperate with the Soviet Union, its science organizations, on outer space matters. So this was the confidential, or this was a low security memo. There was another memo that Kennedy sent. This was top secret. This has never been declassified. It was leaked. It was one of these leaked documents. So in this leaked document, Kennedy, it's a memorandum to the CIA to share classified UFO files with NASA. It was titled Classification Review of All UFO Intelligence Files Affecting National Security. So basically, Kennedy was now telling the CIA that all of the information they had on UFOs and of course extraterrestrial life and so forth had to be shared with NASA. And that this was an important national security issue now because this was going to be new policy of the United States, cooperating with the Soviet Union on all matters concerning outer space and lunar exploration. And so this document actually refers to the earlier memo and the importance of all of these UFO files being shared. So Kennedy's initiative, if he had succeeded, this all happened on November 12. 1963. Kennedy's initiative would have resulted in classified UFO files being given to NASA to share with the USSR as part of the Joint Space Cooperation. 10 days later, less than 2 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated. You might say, well, what a coincidence. Maybe not. There's another leaked demo. This is a leaked document. This is a burn memo, and it concerns MJ-12 issuing a directive sanctioning assassination of any US policyholder. The memo was drafted by Alan Dulles when he was director of the CIA in 1961 and held by the CIA counterintelligence chief James Jesus Angleton, who was instructed when Angleton retired in 1974-75. He was instructed to burn all his files, but some of the files weren't burned and they were taken and they were leaked or released to the public. So this draft, this is a directive regarding project environment. When conditions become non-conducive for growth in our environment and Washington cannot be influenced any further, the weather is lacking any precipitation. It should be wet. Now you think, well, that's cryptic. What does that mean? That sounds strange. Well, basically, what that directive to MJ12 was basically saying was that Washington cannot be influenced. Washington refers to the Kennedy administration, because in '61, Kennedy was in charge. He was the president, and his administration was the one that was basically setting policy. And MJ12, its job was to influence the administration to basically do what it asked it to do. But if Washington cannot be influenced any further, basically saying if the Kennedy administration does not follow our directives, then it makes this cryptic comment, the weather is lacking any precipitation, it should be wet. Well, those involved in any kind of intelligence background know that that's a code for assassination. It should be wet means assassination. So essentially, the Kennedy administration, or President Kennedy's efforts to have joint cooperation in space with the Soviet Union as a means to have UFO files released, according to this document, was directly related to his assassination. Because this document, and there's more documents that I actually cover in the other presentation, which is on the DVD, which we have out there, where you can find out more about what other documentation exists to support this conclusion that in fact Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA counterintelligence division because he was forcing the CIA to release all information concerning UFOs and extraterrestrial life. So now we move to the Clinton administration. So what did President Clinton do? President Clinton told Webster Hubbell, who was a close friend, who was also appointed to a position of authority in his administration in the Department of Justice, if I put you over at Justice, I want you to find answers to two questions for me. One, who killed JFK? And two, are there UFOs? It's an interesting thing that a president would ask one of his closest friends that he appoints to the Department of Justice to find the answers to these two questions. And in fact, Webster Hubbell talked about this in his memoirs after he left the Department of Justice when he was unsuccessful. Hubbell said, quote, "Clinton was dead serious. I had looked into both, but wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting." So basically, Hubbell, on the authority of President Clinton, was trying to find out who was really behind the assassination of Kennedy. It was a conspiracy, but who was behind this conspiracy? And secondly, do UFOs exist? I mean, are there extraterrestrials visiting our world? And Hubbell was saying he was not satisfied with the answers he was getting. So Clinton was not able to get information on classified UFOs from Hubbell or other senior administration officials. He was asking his CIA director to find out. The CIA director was out of the loop. So Clinton, like Kennedy before him, was basically denied access to this information. Bill and Hillary Clinton were given an informal briefing on UFOs and extraterrestrial life from Lawrence Rockefeller in August 1995. Lawrence Rockefeller was the black sheep in the family, if you like. The Rockefeller family had someone who wanted to do good, someone who wanted to help the world, and so Lawrence Rockefeller wanted to help the world by helping the Clinton administration learn the truth about UFOs and telling the American public what is really happening with UFOs. So the Clintons collaborated with the Rockefellers in a new strategy for gaining access to UFO files by expediting declassification of national security files by executive order. So there you see a picture of Hillary Clinton with Lawrence Rockefeller in 1995. He was already in his 80s in 1995. There at his Wyoming ranch, Bill Clinton was there as well. And while they're at the ranch, Rockefeller gives the Clintons an informal briefing about UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Rockefeller tells the Clintons what he knew, because Clinton couldn't find out from his own national security advisors, from his CIA director, from his national security advisor, from his Secretary of Defense. He couldn't find out, what does the US really know about UFOs and extraterrestrial life? What's really going on? He couldn't find out. So he had to go to a very prominent individual, such as Lawrence Rockefeller, who came from this very prestigious family. And Rockefeller knew. He knew the information because it was his brothers that set up the system. And Rockefeller wanted to do good and release some of the secrets. So Rockefeller told the Clintons, both Hillary and Bill Clinton, about this information. And interestingly, immediately after this briefing, the Clintons decided, or Hillary Clinton decided, that this was an issue that they could no longer discuss. That if Clinton was to be re-elected in 1996, he would have no chance if he brought this issue up. But nevertheless, they agreed on a strategy on declassifying national security files. So President Clinton issued Executive Order 12958 in April 17, 1995, for a system of declassifying national security information. Basically, the idea here was to help move the process forward for releasing as much information as possible. Because the more information that was released, the more that UFO researchers, exopolitics researchers such as myself and the general public and the media could kind of piece together what was really happening behind the scenes. That a president himself did not have the power and the authority to tell the world or tell the American public the truth about extraterrestrial life, so that by having this system in place for declassifying information through document releases, that maybe some documents could be released that could confirm that what was really going on. So this was part of the system of open government, or principles of open government, that would be eventually repeated in the Obama administration. But I want to point out that Clinton himself was very unhappy with the way in which he was cut out of the loop. And he kind of described it in a joke. He went to Ireland during his presidency, and someone asked him about the UFO issue, and he actually addressed this issue in Ireland, talking about what it was that he knew or didn't know about UFOs and what he had been told. And so while he makes it sound like a joke, if you listen behind the lines, he's actually giving important information here. So let me play this video clip.
I got a letter from 13-year-old Ryan from Belfast. Now, Ryan, if you're out in the crowd tonight, here's the answer to your question. No. As far as I know, an alien spacecraft did not crash in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And Ryan, if the United States Air Force did recover alien bodies, they didn't tell me about it either, and I want to know.
So there you have President Clinton pointing out that he didn't know whether alien bodies existed at Roswell, that according to the information he had, he couldn't answer that question at all. He didn't know. But if there was information there, he was being denied access, and he wants to know. So that hopefully is just more of an insight into the way the system operates in the United States, where even sitting presidents do not know about these issues, that these issues are so deeply compartmentalized and secret that presidents are out of the loop. So what about the Obama administration? What do they know? What does he know about this issue? Well, Obama, on his very first day after he was inaugurated, he came out and made the promises of open government and having more national security information declassified. He said, for a long time now, there's been too much secrecy in this city. The old rule said that if there was a defensible argument for not disclosing something to the American public, then it should not be disclosed. That era is now over. Starting today, every agency and department should know that this administration stands on the side not of those who seek to withhold information, but those who seek to make it known. So President Obama wants information to be released. He doesn't want there to be so much secrecy. And indeed, under the Obama administration, there has been some progress. Various government agencies have created online digital databases for public scrutiny concerning UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Some of these have been very helpful. For example, the FBI has an online database now with lots of documents that you can read where the FBI discusses its own X-files or files concerning UFOs. Even the National Security Agency has an online digital repository of UFO files and information, as does the CIA. There's no kind of document there that blows the whistle, that kind of that clarifies conclusively that this in fact is something being withheld. But many of the documents kind of are helpful in giving a bit of background information. But overall, Obama's commitment to open government has been a failure. It's been a big disappointment to a lot of people, including myself especially. Millions of files continue to be classified on national security grounds every day. Freedom of Information Act requests regularly denied on national security grounds. Files released only make spurious references to UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Nothing really serious there. And probably the thing that's been most disappointing with the Obama administration is they have not protected whistleblowers. People who come forward to tell the truth about UFOs and extraterrestrial life are being more stringently prosecuted than ever. People who come up and tell information such as I've been sharing are being prosecuted all the time. And this is really a shame, because it means that it's very hard to conclusively investigate and decide and prove the validity of many of these documents that I have been using here that have been leaked. But nevertheless, these documents are part of the online public access open source literature now, and so people can decide for themselves whether or not the documents are credible. But many are official documents, many are unofficial leaked documents, and so people have to decide for themselves what they're going to accept. One of the most important issues here to point out is that multinational corporations now have a vast role in this issue. Many UFO files and information related to extraterrestrial life have been privatized and are now proprietary material of private contractors fulfilling Department of Defense contractors. What that means is that now all of these files, you ask, well, where are the files? Where's the information? Where's the proof about UFOs, extraterrestrial life? Where are they? They used to be in the control of the US bureaucracy, in the control of the Air Force, of the Army, the US Navy, the CIA, FBI. These files have now been moved into private contractors. The repositories or the libraries or the archives of these private contractors now is where all this information is housed. And it's very clever. They do that because Freedom of Information Act requests do not apply to the proprietary material of corporations. In other words, if you want to know about this issue, what the government has been doing on this issue of extraterrestrial life, and you write a Freedom of Information Act request to the Air Force, the Army, Navy, FBI, so forth, they check their records and they say, we don't have any records, because they don't. All of the records have been moved to Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, the Boeing Corporation, and all of these corporations. That's where they are. But you, as a member of the general public, as an American citizen, have no power of authority to get access to these archives. An American president, Congress, does not have access or the right to access these files. FBI, Department of Defense, none of these organizations have access or power to go in there and retrieve these files. So that's how the secrets are kept in Washington. So what are the public policy issues here? I've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to use it to just go over the public policy issues that exist here. What is the constitutional standing of classified executive orders concerning extraterrestrial life? The orders that President Eisenhower originally made to give authority over extraterrestrial life and technology and UFOs to Majestic 12 are classified. They have never been released. Are these valid still? Why should classified executive orders from the 1950s exclude presidents ever since? President Eisenhower did it in the 1950s, and ever since, presidents have been excluded because he issued the executive order to do this. And later on, he regretted that, but unfortunately, that has now been done. To what extent does the public's right to know impact on official efforts to limit information on extraterrestrial life on a need to know? There are two principles here. One is right to know. We all have a right to know what our government is doing. Whether it's the United States government or the Czech government, German government or any government, we all have a right to know. But on the other hand, national security bureaucracies operate on the principle of need to know, that classified information is restricted on need to know access. So how do you balance these two principles? To what extent is a cover-up of information on extraterrestrial life justified? Well, you can say back in the 1950s, maybe it was justified. Maybe the Brookings Institute report was right. That document that I referred to earlier that said that official document from NASA, commissioned by NASA to the US Congress was right. Maybe if in the 1950s or 60s the public was told the truth about extraterrestrial life, maybe there could have been societal disintegration. Maybe religion could have collapsed. Maybe the scientific community would have been in arrears, would have been in great difficulty because many scientific theories would have been shown to be invalid. How to respond to excessive national security measures, example, assassination. How do we deal with the truth? How do we deal with the fact that maybe we learn now, maybe in a few years' time, that in fact a rogue division within the CIA, headed by the head of the CIA counterintelligence division, James Jesus Angleton, was in fact the unit that conducted the assassination of a president. President Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA. How do we deal with that? Who's responsible? How do we deal with the implications? Fifth, to what extent have elected political representatives been denied access to classified UFO ET information? Well, we know from what I've shown you that presidents have tried, that President Kennedy tried to get access to UFO information according to these leaked documents that I've been referring to and showed you here up there, that he tried and failed. He couldn't get the CIA to release the information to him. President Clinton tried. He tried very hard, but he also failed and had to resort to informal processes to get this. Should scientific principles or technologies gained from extraterrestrial life be shared with the general public? Some of these technologies would make the oil industry redundant. The oil industry, fossil fuels, uses very primitive technology. The technology behind cars, airplanes, are early 20th century technologies using internal combustion engines, using liquid propulsion systems and fuel of that nature. Whereas these advanced technologies use very advanced or other principles such as anti-gravity. That would mean that we could have cars that could fly, and that would be a very easy thing to do, that we could move almost instantaneously from one country to another using these anti-gravity technologies with a revolutionary aircraft that now can fly from one city to another city in a matter of half an hour. I could fly from Hawaii to Prague in half an hour rather than taking 24 hours. 7, should public policy decisions concerning extraterrestrial life or technologies be decided in secretly appointed committees veiled from public scrutiny or made transparent in a highly visible public process? So basically, Should these decisions be made privately in a secret committee, or should they be made part of the public process? Should Congress have authority over this? Should now it be an issue that, say, the Democrats have a perspective on extraterrestrial life? The Democratic expression on extraterrestrial life might be, well, welcome extraterrestrials. We want to give you big hugs. Maybe the Republican attitude might be, don't come here, we've got big guns, we'll shoot you if you land. Is this what we want? The political process to take responsibility over these issues, so you have parties taking different positions. Is that a good thing or bad thing? Finally, should multinational corporations fulfilling government contracts be outside of the Freedom of Information Act process? If all of this information that I've been telling you is real, and we want to have access to it, and it's not in the hands of government institutions and bureaucracies, but in the hands of these multinational organisations, then in the United States at least, the Freedom of Information Act should be extended to include all contractors to government agencies and bureaucracies, that the Freedom of Information Act should be improved so that the information is held there. So some of this material, not all of the material, is in my book. I brought just 10 copies of the English version of my book, just 10 copies of that, and I have them out there, and I'll be happy to sign those later. And of course, there's a Czech version. I don't know if there are any copies left, but if not, I believe they are in bookstores in Prague. And so those are the issues that I cover in the book, and some of which I've covered here. So thank you all very much. It's been a privilege to be able to address you. Thank you.